E nada contra o Santa Clara, eu já disse nada, mas esta doeu muito. Eu tenho muitos anos de futebol.
Cristiano Ronaldo led the memorial as Champions League winning captain under José Mourinho. Jorge Costa passed away at the age of 53. The moment was heavy, the silence profound. At FC Porto's training ground, the very place where Jorge Costa once roared instructions, where he once lifted trophies, now stood teammates, protégés, and legends, mourning the sudden loss of a man who never stopped leading. On August 5, 2025, Jorge Costa collapsed during routine duties at the Porto Training Center. Despite immediate medical intervention, he was pronounced dead from cardiac arrest, leaving behind not just a club, but a country in mourning. He was 53 years old. Known as Bicho, the Beast, Jorge Costa embodied leadership. As the captain of FC Porto, he was the heart of a golden generation, lifting the Champions League trophy in 2004 under José Mourinho and setting a standard of toughness, loyalty, and sheer willpower. His presence on the pitch was unmatched. His commitment to the club, unshakable. But Jorge's legacy didn't end with his final match. He returned to Porto not for glory, but for service, taking on roles as manager, advisor, and most recently, sporting director. He mentored the next generation, still walking the pitch, still wearing the crest close to his heart. The news of his death has rocked Portuguese football. Ronaldo, Mourinho, and countless former teammates have expressed their sorrow. Fans across the country are lighting candles, sharing stories, remembering a man who gave everything to the game and never asked for applause. This video explores the life and final chapter of Jorge Paulo Costa Almeida, the warrior in blue and white. From the locker rooms of Estadio do Dragão to the touchline where his final day began, this is a tribute to a man who never left the field, even when the game was over. Some captains lead with words. Jorge Costa led with presence, and now his silence speaks louder than ever. To understand the weight of Jorge Costa's loss, you must first understand what he meant to Portuguese football, not just as a player, but as a symbol of a generation forged in loyalty, grit, and steel. Jorge wasn't merely a part of FC Porto's history. He was the anchor, the backbone, the kind of captain who didn't need speeches because his presence did the talking. Born in Porto on October 14, 1971, Jorge Paulo Costa Almeida was destined to carry the identity of the city on his shoulders. He joined FC Porto's youth academy as a teenager and quickly stood out. Not for flair, but for ferocity. Coaches called him intense. Opponents called him a nightmare. Teammates called him indispensable. By the early 1990s, he was wearing the senior jersey, carving out a reputation as one of the most aggressive, intelligent defenders in Europe. He wasn't fast, but he was always there. He wasn't flashy, but he never lost a duel without leaving a scar. Fans adored him because he bled for the shirt, literally and metaphorically. At a time when Portuguese football was rising but still searching for identity, Jorge Costa embodied what Porto wanted to be, unbreakable. He became captain in 1997, and under his leadership, the club entered one of the most iconic eras in its history. Then came José Mourinho. When Mourinho arrived at FC Porto in 2002, he found in Jorge not just a captain, but a field general. Their chemistry was instant, built on shared discipline and ruthless ambition. Together, they built a squad that didn't just win, it dominated. And in 2004, they shocked the world. Against the odds, FC Porto conquered Europe, winning the UEFA Champions League. It wasn't just a victory for the club, it was a moment that put Portuguese football on the global map. And at the center of it all, lifting the trophy, eyes steel set and heart full, was Jorge Costa. But leadership for him didn't end when the cameras stopped. He was known for staying late after training, mentoring young players, and offering brutally honest feedback to teammates who dared slack off. He wasn't always easy, but he was always right there in the thick of it. After retiring as a player in 2006, Jorge transitioned into coaching and management. He led various clubs across Portugal and Europe, always returning to Porto as a spiritual home. In his final years, he took on the role of sporting director, mentoring from the sidelines, protecting the club's DNA, What makes his passing so devastating is not just that it was sudden, it's that he was still active, still involved, still walking the very ground where his legend was born. He wasn't done. He never really stepped away. And that brings us to the theme that defines his story: loyalty until the last breath. Jorge Costa didn't just play for Porto, he belonged to it. His leadership wasn't ceremonial. It was lived, breathed, enforced. Now with his death, the club loses not just a former captain, but a living standard, a reference point, a heartbeat. And in the silence he leaves behind, the question begins to form. What happens when the man who held the walls together is no longer there to hold them? Jorge Costa's rise wasn't scripted for headlines. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't effortless. It was forged in bruises, tackles, and countless moments that only the true fans remember. Not because they were flashy, but because they mattered. Because he made them matter. He began his professional career with FC Porto in 1989. At just 18 years old, he walked into a locker room of seasoned veterans, determined to prove he belonged. He didn't rely on talent alone. He brought something deeper: resilience. His early years were marked by intense competition, moments on the bench, loan spells, and setbacks. But Jorge didn't flinch. He studied, he learned, and slowly he carved out space, not just in the lineup, but in the identity of the team. By the mid-90s, Jorge Costa had become a mainstay in Porto's defense. He partnered with the likes of Aloisio, Ricardo Carvalho, and other defensive icons, becoming the kind of player who made everyone around him stronger. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the tallest, but he was the smartest. He read the game like a chessboard, 2 moves ahead, and when he tackled, he made it felt. His leadership qualities began to emerge not just in words, but in presence. Younger players gravitated toward him. He wasn't warm, but he was reliable. If he said you could do better, you did. Not because you were afraid of him, but because you didn't want to disappoint him. In 1997, he was named club captain. It was more than an armband. It was an acknowledgement of a man who had lived every inch of the club, from its youth system to its European ambitions. As captain, he led Porto to multiple Primeira Liga titles, domestic cups, and deep European campaigns. But Jorge wanted more. He wanted immortality. That moment came with José Mourinho. Under Mourinho's guidance, Jorge became the spine of a tactical revolution. Porto wasn't just winning, they were suffocating opponents, outthinking them, breaking them down piece by piece. Jorge was the enforcer, the silent threat, the general who never left the battlefield. The 2003 UEFA Cup was the beginning. The 2004 Champions League was the crowning moment. That night in Gelsenkirchen, when Porto defeated AS Monaco 3-0, Jorge Costa lifted the Champions League trophy high above his head. It wasn't just a club victory, it was a national statement. Portugal had arrived, and at the heart of it, not a striker, not a magician, but a defender. A man whose shirt was always soaked, whose shins were always bruised, and whose eyes never looked away from the challenge. After that high, many players might have faded, but Jorge stayed hungry. Even when loaned briefly to Charlton Athletic, even when age caught up with his pace, he never lowered his standards. He returned to Porto, finished his career where he started, and left the pitch the same way he played on it, without fanfare, without tears, without ego. But Jorge Costa didn't disappear. Retirement was just another transformation. He took up coaching, managing clubs like Braga, Olanense, and others across Europe and Asia. He wasn't looking for headlines. He was looking for impact. Every team he led, whether it was in Romania or Tunisia, carried something Porto had taught him. No one fears talent, but everyone respects discipline. Eventually, he came home. As sporting director at FC Porto, Jorge walked the same corridors, stood in the same dugouts, and led a new generation. He was no longer in cleats, but he was still on the front lines, scouting, advising, defending the values he had once embodied on the field. And then, on August 5th, 2025, during another ordinary day at the training ground, his life ended as it had been lived, in the service of the club he loved. He didn't fall from grace. He rose until the very last moment, and even in death, he remained exactly what he had always been: a defender. Jorge Costa's passing was sudden, but it was also deeply symbolic. A man who had lived his life for football, for Porto, for discipline and structure, took his final breath at the very heart of it all. Not in a hospital, not at home, but on the grounds of the training center where he had spent decades forging champions and setting standards. He died doing what he never stopped doing, showing up. The official cause of death was confirmed by club sources: cardiac arrest. No scandal, no controversy, just a life lived at full pace, ending without warning. But in the days following his death, something began to emerge, something deeper than tribute. A wave of reflection swept through the world of Portuguese football. From players to coaches to fans, the question was the same. How do you fill the space left behind by a man like Jorge Costa? Cristiano Ronaldo, often guarded in public, led the memorial procession. His face, usually carved in stone, carried visible grief. He was more than a captain. He was a guardian of Portuguese football. We all played harder because Jorge Costa was watching. José Mourinho, rarely short of words, kept his tribute brief, but piercing. Without him, 2004 doesn't happen. He was the soul of that team. And he never once asked for credit. Teammates who had shared a locker room with him spoke about the silence that followed his presence. The way you'd notice when he wasn't around. Not because things fell apart, but because something stopped holding them together. Media outlets ran retrospectives, but none of them captured what fans already knew. That Jorge Costa was never a man of spectacle. He was a man of substance. He didn't chase headlines, he chased results. And in that pursuit, he earned something few players ever do: respect that endured beyond the game. Outside Estadio do Dragão, fans built a shrine, scarves, candles, posters from 2004. A handwritten sign read, "Not just our captain, our shield." Among all the tributes, perhaps the most emotional came from a former Porto Academy player, now in his mid-20s. When I broke down in training, he didn't yell. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I made mistakes too. The key is to never make them again tomorrow." I never forgot that. He made me believe I belonged. That was Jorge's quiet legacy. Not just the trophies, not just the tackles, but the mentorship, the integrity, the lessons whispered in corridors, shared during injury rehab, repeated after training when the cameras were long gone. In many ways, Jorge Costa was the kind of man modern football rarely produces anymore. Not built for social media, not driven by brand, but forged in loyalty, in sweat, and in something much harder to measure: accountability. And so, when he collapsed on the field, it felt like something larger fell with him. Not just a man, not just a captain, but a symbol of how football used to be: earned, lived, felt. Now FC Porto must go on without its soul, and Portuguese football without one of its fiercest guardians. At Legends and Secrets, we don't just honor victories, we trace the emotional weight behind them. And when it comes to Jorge Costa, we believe his legacy transcends medals, minutes played, or even trophies lifted. What he left behind wasn't just footballing success, it was a standard, a presence, a lesson. Jorge Costa represented something football often forgets in the modern era: silent leadership, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't chase fame, the kind that simply shows up, does the work, and makes everyone else rise to the occasion without saying a word. He wasn't a celebrity. He didn't care about cameras, he didn't post quotes or slogans. But if you asked anyone who shared a pitch, a bench, or a locker room with him, they would tell you the same thing. When Jorge was around, we were better, because we had to be. His death reminds us how rare those figures truly are. We've seen generations of footballers chase highlights, but Jorge lived in the moments between them, in the discipline of the back line, in the strategy of positioning, in the grind of training. He knew that glory was fleeting, but identity was built day by day, tackle by tackle, truth by truth. Jorge never asked to be idolized. In fact, he resisted it. What he wanted was respect, not from strangers, but from teammates, from coaches, from the young players coming up who needed someone to show them the way. And that's why his absence is felt so deeply. Because we didn't just lose a man, we lost a compass. So now we ask, in an era of instant fame and disposable legends, what is the true legacy of a man like Jorge Costa? Is it the trophy in 2004? Is it the roar of the fans? Or is it the way young defenders still study his positioning, still repeat his phrases in the tunnel, still remember the calm he brought in chaos? We believe it's all of the above, and more. Jorge Costa proved that greatness doesn't always wear a spotlight. Sometimes it wears a captain's armband, keeps its head down, and leaves behind a silence louder than any applause. And we invite you to remember him not just as a champion, but as a man who never stopped leading, even when the game was over. There are captains who lift trophies, and then there are captains who lift a club. Its standards, its history, its soul. Jorge Costa was the second kind. He didn't chase the spotlight. He didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. But his presence filled rooms, stabilized teams, and defined eras. When he walked through the halls of Estadio de Dragón, even after retirement, people straightened their posture. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Now those halls feel quieter. His passing doesn't just mark the end of a career, it marks the loss of a compass, of a living connection to a time when football wasn't filtered through algorithms and endorsements, but through sweat, sacrifice, and steel. Fans will remember the 2004 Champions League final, the raised trophy, the roaring crowd, the man in blue who stood in the center, unshaken. But the truest legacy of Jorge Costa lives in moments the cameras missed. The whispered advice to a young defender, the correction after a missed mark in training, the hand on a teammate's back after a tough loss. Those moments don't go viral. They don't make highlight reels, but they build teams. They build trust. They build greatness. Some stories are never told, but now you know. Jorge Costa was more than a footballer. He was a guardian, a reminder that real leadership doesn't retire. It endures, in memories, in standards, and in the silence left behind when the strongest voice never needed to raise itself. And though he may never walk the pitch again, his shadow will always be there, just behind the next captain, just outside the locker room door, just beneath the roar of a Porto crowd that will never forget the man who never forgot them.